Sarah. Like I said, I just graduated from University of Hull. I'll be studying my Masters by Research in Leeds next month. A tiny bit about my experience in biosciences education. I was considered a health risk at college. Those were the words, so they banned me from campus. I then dealt with a lot of accessibility issues at university. Some of you in the North may have seen some of the articles in the news on the BBC about it. So I approached Catherine to do an article with me, kind of confronting ableism that me and other disabled students have faced globally at university. So what is ableism? For me, the phrase, "the world isn't built for me," it rings very true. You know, I'm considered a failure for not being able to walk. You know, I go down the high street, 50% of shops I can't get in because there's steps. Simple things like that, where it's ingrained in our society that the world is not accessible for disabled people. For example, if you look at the medical model of disability, I'm the one who's disabled. If you look at social, the world is disabling towards me. So I need to be fixed because I have the disability, rather than creating a space for me that's accessible for me to access. So there's a long history of ableism, kind of starts at the start of humanity. You know, in Roman law, it was law to kill a disabled child because they're not worth living. They're not going to bring anything to our society, so they don't deserve to be there. It carries on through to present day with that thinking. If we look at some groups in Africa, they are encouraged to sacrifice and mutilate disabled children as they're seen as cursed. And we see that through asylums that were set up in Britain, where the last one only closed about 15 years ago. There was someone locked there against their will for 50 years because they had a disability. And then where it relates to biosciences, once we understood where disability really came from, when it's genetics or environment, we came with a thought process of eugenics, which is lovely. The founder of it is Francis Galton. He's responsible for a lot of statistic methods that we still use to this day. He is a pioneer of the subject, for statistics and for eugenics. He coined the term eugenics. He also believed in selective breeding, so those he considered inferior should be sterilized, which included Black people, people of color, immigrants, and disabled people. He then had his protege. They both worked at UCL, where it's Carl Pearson, who's a mathematician and biostatistician. He created a lot of the tests we all use today in R to analyze our work. He also founded a lot of the journals that some of you may even be published in. He also considered, as Francis Galton did, that people of color and disabled people are of lower race. He also agreed with Nazism and what happened during the war, with the mass murder and sterilization of the Jewish, Black, and disabled communities. So how UCL, they only last couple of years acknowledged their role in eugenics and the murder and oppression that came from it. They have not acknowledged it, many other institutions have not. So how does it manifest in formal education? The UN obviously says that people with disabilities should not be excluded from general education just due to their disability. Yet a lot of wheelchair users are forced into special schools where they shouldn't be because general education, high schools and colleges refuse to make accommodations. So that's the only place they can go to have their education. There have been many studies and articles published on people's experiences, whether it's having ADHD, having a disability like mine where you need a wheelchair, autism. There was an 11-year-old girl who was forced out of her school because her peers' parents thought that she shouldn't be there. Another 11-year-old boy was forced to stay inside during playtime because the other boys didn't want to play football with him. And the teachers didn't want to help him access that and change the mindset. So how do we find that ableism manifests in the biosciences? Obviously, we have laboratory and field work. So labs are often, especially undergraduate labs, are very noisy, crowded spaces, which can be very overwhelming for people who are autistic or have hearing impairments. You need good time management, which often makes it hard for students with ADHD to be able to be successful in those areas. Every lab I've been in, headphones are banned. So to stop having a meltdown, often people with autism use headphones to be able to censor out the noise. Also for disabled staff, often demonstration benches and audiovisual equipment, as you can see, are often inaccessible, but there's no alternative. And obviously a lot of service animals are not allowed in labs. There was a study done last year where a risk assessment was put in place and someone with a service animal was able to do their lab work whilst maintaining a sterile environment. There's an example of it is able to be done. With field work, it presents a lot more barriers because of how many potential, that there are so many variabilities when you go out in the field. So a lot of different disabilities are impacted a lot differently when you come across a new scenario. For me, I've become very self-conscious because, well, I have blue hair and I have a wheelchair. I stick out like a sore thumb. So when I'm not being able to do things that everyone else is able to do, it makes you feel worse. It makes you feel like you're not competent as a scientist like everyone else is. Another study found that someone with a mobility impairment felt uncomfortable and they had a reduced quality of experience in the field because their accommodations were not put in place and their lecturer had not thought of, obviously you can't think of everything and you need to think on your feet sometimes when you're in the field to come up with accommodations that will make it right. But things were not put in place beforehand to make that student be able to succeed in the way that they should have been able to. And then residential field trips are even more complex with being able to get medication over there, specialist supplies, having to send massive pieces of equipment that you may need, and then you come across quality laws. For example, in France, accessibility is encouraged. It's not enforced. It's not in legislation anywhere. So many places you come across are completely inaccessible. And you imagine what it's like even more in a less developed country. Equality laws are even less frequent. So, and then go into learning resources. Excuse me. So I was disabled student representative at my university. So I made it mandatory that we had closed captioning, image descriptions on every piece of content that came out of the university, whether it was on the website, your lectures, seminars, documents that were sent out, so that every student had access to the same level of education as everyone else. And with assessment, it's thinking about whether in your curriculum, if you have certain skills that you think are key skills, how can you make the assessment for it inclusive for everybody? So if you're looking at microscopy images, how can you make that accessible for a blind student? Can you look at research studies that have done that? There was one released last year. They've been able to create those images in 3D so that you can read them just using your hands. Obviously, it requires the same level of teaching those blind students as it is for a sighted student how to read those images. And with intellectual ideas, obviously, ableist biases are most obvious when we look at genetic disease or genetics and disease. We can look at the language that is used. For example, I have what you would refer to as a birth defect. So I have a spinal condition where my spine didn't form properly. I'm not a big fan of the term, as I don't consider myself defective. There is more inclusive language that can be used, especially when you're talking in terms of humans, especially humans in front of you that may have a genetic condition or a disease. If you look at cystic fibrosis and Down syndrome, often you'll find that doctors or students will say that they have a low quality of life or a poorer quality of life. If you asked my uncle that, who had Down syndrome, I think he would disagree with you. He lived a pretty full life. Just like everyone else, like I've had a genetics lecture where they said that muscular dystrophy would have a horrible effect on someone's life. They wouldn't live the same quality of life. My friend is 20, he has a girlfriend, he has a degree, he has a job, he plays sport and competes in it. I think he's living a very full life. So I think generalizing that comes from a very ableist bias perspective that if you're disabled, you live less of a life than everybody else. Now, positive steps that we can take, I think, as we've all heard today, acknowledging the history behind some of the ideas that have come forward is very important. I would have liked to have known about all the different tests I use pretty much every day and are created by eugenicists and how they impacted science as a whole. I think it's important as educators to research language that is inclusive, so someone doesn't suffer with Down syndrome, they have it. Just because they have a disability doesn't mean they are having a horrible life or they are suffering from it. If we look at field-based learning, I think it's important that you have accessibility everywhere, so accessible toilets either on site or nearby, so that you know that every student you have can come there with you. allowing carers, whether they're family members, friends, or trained carers, to come along and assist, because it's important to know that sometimes you're given a carer from the university. You're then having to spend the day telling them what you need help with, and you're ending up spending more time talking to them, telling them how to assist you, rather than you actually doing what you're there to do. I think open discussion is a big part of taking positive steps towards disability inclusion. So with my supervisor, we'd always look at a map, see how far exactly where we're going, what the terrain looks like, if I could go a different route, if I needed to, but be able to learn all the skills I needed to that day are the same as everyone else. I just needed to take a different route. Obviously, it's different for other disabilities, whether someone with autism can wear headphones during their trip, they can get a pack with what they need to be doing, and then they can go and learn, they can go and do what field work they need to be doing. You know, talk to the student afterwards, what can be improved about their experience, like before, during, and after, like, did everything go okay? Is there something that could be improved next time? Obviously, there's limits to how many times you can go and do inclusive training, but I think it's important to make sure that when we're talking about race, gender, sexuality, that we also include disability in the conversation. So, are you getting training where disability is included in that? With learning resources, I think a really good one was having emails sent out at the beginning of a module, the beginning of the year, asking what format is most accessible for people, so that if you're putting stuff on, we used Canvas, that a PDF and a Word document was put on. Simple things like that, so that they don't have to spend extra time worrying if their learning is going to be impacted because something isn't accessible to them, or accessible to their screen readers, for example. So do your lectures and seminars, do your slides have image descriptions, closed captions, figure captions? Are they well described? If a blind student is having a graph figure caption read out, are they going to really be able to understand the data that they're hearing? If you can't see that graph, would you be able to understand what you've written? And with like slides, if you've got text on the screen, make sure it's actual text and not just an image with text on it. A screen reader's not going to be able to read that, and you could be missing information for some students. For assessments, simple things, just asking, because obviously a lot of the time you have a department for disability, like disability and welfare and things like that. Just make sure that your students have those adjustments in place, because sometimes there's just a missing connection, and one department hasn't talked to another, and a student's left without their adjustments. You can have stop the clock so they can take a break, stretch, take their medication, do what they need to do. If you're having like a closed book, like time limited exam, could you give a student a 48-hour submission window? There are some people who have complex disabilities. If you have a seizure disorder, if you've had a seizure, it's very hard to then go and do an exam for an hour at that very specific time. So maybe give them the option of having that window so that they can manage their disability whilst having the same opportunities in education during that exam. Are your practicals inclusive? Like I said about using microscopes, you can also look at for example, if it's a lab-based practical, are your labs accessible? Do you have rise and fall benches and fume hoods? Are those benches large enough to accommodate all equipment? I was given pretty much this exact same space to be able to analyze so many things. I needed the same amount of bench space as everybody else. So make sure that it's equal. Everyone has the equal access to everything in the lab. Like, welcome to the lab materials. Like, do they know where their fire exits are? For example, for me, I need to know what stairwell I need to go to so that I can stay safe if there is a fire. Where are the accessible toilets in regard to the lab? Things like that. Just where first aid facilities are, just so that it reduces anxiety in an unfamiliar environment. They don't have to think about their disability when they get there. Like, okay, I'm taken care of. If I need something, I know where it is. Allow breaks. If you're giving presentations or just giving instructions to students, maybe turn off a really loud piece of equipment so someone doesn't have sensory overload, so they can really listen to what you're saying and understand.